I'm going to be talking about passive acoustic monitoring, which is part of what I'm doing for my research for my PhD degree.
Ny fikarohana ataony zany dia momba ny fanaraha-maso tsy manan-korontana amin'ny alalan'ny feo moa no nandikana azy.
So to start off with, all of the slides have Malagasy translations in the italics. So the English will be in the straight text and the Malagasy will be in the italics underneath.
Efa tonga dia nadika teny gasy melo natao italika io ny version teny malagasy.
So what is bioacoustics that forms the basis of this bioacoustic monitoring? It's essentially the study of animal sound, and it's particularly beneficial for the rainforest, like we have here, where animals sometimes don't have visual signals because there's lots of trees in the way. You can't always see very far, but sound travels much farther than animals can typically see in the forest.
Inona moa no atao hoe bioacoustic na feo an-javamananaina? Anatin'ny ala mando ohatran'izao dia mora kokoa ny manadiady momba ny feon'ny biby satria matevina ny ala mando dia misy tombony kokoa ny feo raha anatin'ny ala noho ny fahitana izay voafetra.
And these calls give us insights as to what the animals are doing, right? They produce different sounds for different behavioral contexts, if they're feeding or traveling or resting, so we can get a lot of information from these calls.
Ahafahana mikaroka sy mandinika bebe kokoa ny feo na ny antso izay ataon'ny biby ohatran'ny hoe ahafantarana ny toetra ny fitondrantenany ny habetsany.
So to give you some examples of that, I have some example calls that you can hear, and hopefully the sound will be okay. So you might recognize some of the birds calling in that.
Karazana feo maro zao no ao fa ny vorona moa zany tena eny tonga dia miavaka eo.
So this is sauna, maybe Kelly. And my species, the Varazatsi, Varicea. So that's just some of the different sounds that you can hear in the forest here.
Zay aby moa ohatr'izay ny karazana feo heno anaty ala any.
Okay, and we can also tell a lot about animals because of what's called the acoustic niche hypothesis, which basically means that the more different animal species that are in the forest, the more sound there should be.
Hoe misy karazany maro moa zany ny feo dia ahafantarana hoe manitsy famantarana ny biby mba ampiana ny fanelingelenana ny feo avy amin'ny biby hafa.
So these are some very vocal animals like you just heard, the blue kua, sauna, Varazatsi. So what are we measuring? Those images that you just saw are called spectrograms, like what you can see down here. It's a little dark. So basically what this is, it's a picture of sound, basically. So on the y-axis here, this is frequency, which is like the pitch of a sound.
Inona ary no refesina? Aseho amin'ny alalan'ny sary ny feo, izay ampiasana ny spectrogram, izay io ny fanehoana an-tsary ny feo, dia ny tsipika aksa mitsangana moa zany ny ahitana ny fréquence na ny atetika, ary ny tsivalana dia ny fotoana sy ny loko izay ahafahana mahalala ny hamafin'ny feo sy ny heriny.
Yeah. So the color is like the power. So you saw during the cyclone, it was all red. And that means that there was a lot of noise. So it normally goes from like blue to green to red with increasing loudness.
Amin'ny alalan'ny loko iny moa ny ahafantarana ny tanjaky ny feo. Ohatrany tamin'ny cyclone iny zao menamena be ny loko hita teo amin'ny sary, dia miainga avy amin'ny manga, dia maitso, dia mavo, dia mena ny farany ambony.
And you can extract different measurements from these spectrograms that can tell you a lot if you're trying to find a specific animal.
Le hoe ahafahana maka masotsivana manokana ahafantarana ny karazana biby iray ny eo amin'ny spectrogram.
So another kind of big term to know is the soundscape. So that just means all of the sounds that are being produced in an environment.
Ny soundscape dia hoe ny fakana feo avy amin'ny tontolon'ny habakabaka sy ny fotoana.
So you can break it down into 3 categories, which are biophony, which is animals. Geophony is like wind and rain or the river that's flowing out there. And then anthrophony is human noises. So people talking or machines, anything like that.
Dia ny feo rehetra izay dia afaka zaraina karazany 3. Ny biophonie izay feona biby, ohatran'ny vorona sy sahona ary ny biby mampinono teo. Dia ny géophonie feon'ny géofizika toy ny rivotra sy ny rano ary ny orana. Ary ny anthrophonie feon'olombelona na feo zavatra ataon'olombelona.
So that's just a little background about acoustics, just so you have a framework to work from. And now we'll get into the actual acoustic monitoring part.
Inona ary no atao hoe fanaraha-maso tsy manan-korotana amin'ny alalan'ny feo?
So this is basically just using special recorders, which you can see on your tables, and you're welcome to touch and open and look at. There's a couple different kinds that like you can see. So we'll go into all of those in a bit.
Ny fanaraha-maso io dia ampiasana ny fitaovana fangalana feo izay hitantsika eny ambony latabatra ireny. Misy karazany 2 izy ireo, afaka jerena ny kely sy iray lehibe io.
You guys will get to do your own like little deployments in the second half of the workshop.
Afaka mampiatra ny fampiasana azy moa tsika fa afaka mijery daholo.
So there's a couple different reasons why using acoustic monitoring is beneficial compared to, for example, having people on the ground doing transects or using camera traps.
Misy tombontsoa kokoa ny fanaovana ny PAM satria mora kokoa ny mampiasa azy noho ny hoe olona mihitsy no manao ny fikarohana anaty ala.
So for one, it's less invasive. So when humans are in the forest, we don't always know if our presence is impacting their behavior, and they might not call as frequently when people are there, especially in places where, for example, they might be hunted.
Zany hoe tsy dia miparitaka, tsy misy fiantraikany amin'ny biby moa zany ny fampiasana azy ity satria mety misy fiantraikany amin'ny biby raha olona mihitsy no mandeha anaty ala any.
You can survey multiple species simultaneously, right? Because the recorders record all sounds, so birds and frogs and lemurs all at the same time.
Dia hoe afaka manadiady biby maro satria avy dia miaraka alaina daholo ny feon'ny sahona, ny vorona, ny gidro.
It's relatively low cost. We'll get into more about the price of everything in a bit, but it's a fairly low cost way to survey a large area.
Dia mora kokoa ny sarany amin'ny fampiasana azy satria raha apetraka iny dia afaka maka feo amin'ny toerana somary lehibe kokoa.
And as opposed to something like a camera trap or a trail camera, which faces just one direction, microphones take in sound from 360 degrees.
Dia hoe ny feo tsy ohatran'ny caméra trap izay direction iray ihany fa ny feo rehetrarehetra manodidina anazy azony daholo.
And it can be good for rare or cryptic species that may not come into the same area very frequently, or like nocturnal species, things like that. It, like we kind of already talked about, it decreases the on the ground effort. So there's less people that have to go out on foot and look for animals, less time.
Ary mora ampiasaina koa izy amin'ny biby toy ny hoe sarotra hita na mandeha amin'ny alina dia somary mampiena ny ezaka atao izany hoe tsy dia olona no mandeha anaty ala foana fa ny fitaovana ihany no maka ny feo eo.
And as I'm sure many of the CVB techs know, going through the forest is very difficult because there's a lot of dense vegetation. So surveys on the ground can be hard, especially if, for example, you are studying lemurs that are running through the trees while you have to run through the ground.
Loatran'ny hoe manaraka biby zao dia matevina ny ala dia sarotra kokoa ho an'ny olona ny hiazakazaka hanenjika azy noho ny hoe manadiady ny feony.
And because we normally sleep at night and we don't go out in bad weather, like the cyclone, Batsirai, we can get data from those situations and actually see like what a cyclone sounds like without having to obviously send people into a very dangerous situation.
Dia ohatra koa hoe amin'ny alina tsika matory na hoe amin'ny andron'ny cyclone ireny tsy afaka mandeha mivoaka manao ny fikarohana dia izay koa ny tombotsoa azo avy amin'ny fandraisana feo io.
But it's obviously not a perfect method. So, for example, not all animals are very vocal.
Izany hoe tsy misy fetrany ihany moa izany izy satria misy ny biby sasany tsy mamoaka feo na hoe ambany ny feony.
So like the chameleons, they will not make that much sound. You obviously can't really study them from acoustic monitoring.
Ohatra ny tanalahy zao tsy dia misy feony dia tsy afaka ampiarana an'izay.
Also, animals differ in how loud they are, which affects the detection distance. So the louder an animal is, the farther away it can be for the microphone to pick it up.
Dia arakaraky ny halaviran'ny faritra misy an'ilay biby sy ny fitaovana iny koa no ny fetran'izay satria raha lavitra no misy an'ilay biby nefa ny fitaovana ity koa ohatra amin'ny toerana fanalavitra dia tsy hita an'izay ilay biby.
And as we'll get into a little bit later, it yields a lot of data. Audio files, the sounds are very large files. We're talking like gigabytes or terabytes of data, which can be difficult to analyze, but I will get into analysis methods later on.
Dia ny données azo avy aminy moa dia somary mavesatra. Tena ilaina disque dur lehibe mihitsy satria amina terabyte ny données azo avy amin'ny fangalana feo io.
So what can you actually do with the data? There's a couple different use cases that I'm doing in my research and that other people do as well. One of the kind of main things is detecting specific species.
Inona ary ny azoko atao amin'ny PAM io? Izany hoe raha espèce anankiray dia fampiasana espèce iray.
So for example, this is Rhonomophanes way up at the top. And I put up these devices that you're seeing in front of you throughout the corridor between Rhonomophone up here and Andringatra down here. And so all the purple dots are where we put a recorder.
Na metaka ny fitaovana fangalana feo karazany roa hitantsika ireny nanaraka ny corridor iny dia amin'ireny toerana misy ny point volomparasy ireny moa izany nametahana ny ray amin'izy reto.
And our target species is the black and white ruffed lemurs, the Varazatsi. So we're trying to see where they are in the corridor.
Dia ny tena antony moa zany dia hoe atraiza anatin'io corridor io no misy ny varijasy.
You can also look at things like temporal patterns, so how the sounds change over time and what that might be related to. So different seasons or during the day versus during the night.
Ny fomba nanaovana azy moa le ahitana anazy hoe amin'ny alina sy amin'ny atoandro mandritra ny vanim-potoana io.
And like I mentioned, you can use it to track natural disasters like wildfires or cyclones to see kind of before and after what the sounds are like.
Dia nandritra ny vanim-potoana maromaro no nanaovana izay dia nisy ny cyclone sy ny doro-tanety tao anatin'izay.
And for conservation, we're obviously interested in illegal activities, for example, gunshots that may be indicative of poaching. So this is what like a gunshot would look like.
Anatin'ny fiarovana tontolo iainana ity moa misy ny zavatra tsy ara-dalàna izay ataon'olombelona toy ny bobasy dia io hitantsika amin'ny sary izao ny feon'ny bobasy anatin'ny fangalana feo io.
And other things like chainsaws might be indicative of logging if you're in a protected area where that's not supposed to be happening, or the sound of boats in the water might be indicative of illegal fishing.
Dia misy koa ny ohatran'ny hoe fanatsofana hazo na tevy ala anaty ala any dia ny feona sambo na ny fanjonoana koa afaka alaina amin'io. Dia hita eo ny fihetsikin'ny biby manoloana an'ireo hetsika izay tsy ara-dalàna ataon'ny olombelona ireo.
And then you can compare the sounds to other kinds of data like ecological data, so different habitats, disturbance levels, and things like that.
Dia afaka ampitahina amin'ny fari-piainan'ny tontolo iainana koa toy ny hoe karazana toeram-ponenana, ny kalitaony sy ny ariny.
You can also, if you have at least 3 recorders that are time synchronized, you can localize the sound and actually tell the exact location of where the animal is calling from.
Dia afaka afantarana moa ny toerana misy ilay biby fa farafahakeliny mampiasa fitaovana fandraisam-peo anankitelo izay vao afaka ahitana anazy hoe eto ny tena misy an'ilay biby satria tsy mitovy ny fotoana tongavan'ny feo amin'ny fitaovana fandraisam-peo tsirairay avy.
And the last kind of major use case is not looking at just one species or one event, but looking at the spectrogram as a whole.
Izany hoe ny famakafakana amin'ny ambaratonga amin'ny feo rehetrarehetra dia mampiasa ny indisy akoustika ity.
So the indices are basically just mathematical calculations of the frequencies, so different frequency bands, and the power of different frequencies over time.
Izany hoe samy hafa daholo ny fréquence-ny samy manana ny fréquence-ny aby ny biby tsirairay avy dia misy kajy matematika izay ahafantarana ny herin'ny feo isaky ny biby.
And this is good because these indices have been found to correlate with things like species richness. So this is down here, the number of species in an area, and each of these is a different index. And you can see that you can kind of tell there are trends between the acoustic index and the number of species.
Loatra ny indisy io moa zany tena zavatra ilaina amin'ny analyse de données izay hita eo ny recherche spécifique.
So without having to go through the spectrograms and find every single animal and identify every single animal, these indices are a way to comprehensively see how many species are in an area without actually having to go through and identify every species.
Le afahana mamatatra ny espèce-ny biby tsirairay avy dia afaka hita amin'ny indisy io ihany koa no anavahana ny biby tsirairay avy.
So the reason that the species richness correlates is because in theory, back to that acoustic niche hypothesis I mentioned in the beginning, in theory, animals tend to not call over each other. So different animal groups occupy different frequencies.
Ny hoe misy fotoana miaraka ny biby dia samy manana ny fréquence-ny avy ireo arakaraky ny karazan'ny biby ary malalaka ny karazam-peo ampiasaina.
So, for example, insects, Bibi Kelly, tend to be at really high frequencies, whereas things like birds tend to kind of be in the middle, and mammals are kind of down at the lower frequencies. And human sounds are also tend to be low frequency.
Loatran'ny bibikely zao ohatran'ny angely ireny tena ambony ny fréquence dia ny vorona somary eo ampovoany dia ny mammifère sy ny olombelona ambany ambony kokoa ny basy.
And the acoustic indices also correlate with habitat type or things like habitat disturbance. And that's because sound travels through different habitats in different ways that the indices can pick up on.
Dia arakaraky ny toeram-ponenan'ny biby ihany koa ny andehanan'ny feo.
So, for example, the forest that's very dense, sound doesn't travel very far because there are so many trees in the way that block the sound from going through.
Loatra ny anaty ala ao zao raha betsaka ala matevina dia ny feo afaka mandefa tohanan'ny hazo tsikelikely.
But for example, if you went to the dry forests in the west, like if you went to Karindi, there's much less vegetation, so sound can travel farther because there's not as many kind of obstacles in the way.
Dia ohatra raha amin'ny ala maina any andrefana indray dia afaka tonga lavitra ny feo satria somary mazava ny aty ala ary malaky kokoa ny andehanan'ny feo iny rehefa tsy misy misakana.
So those are some of the different things that you can do with the data that you get. But now you've got to actually go and get the data. So that requires particular pieces of equipment like the recorders. And there's kind of three main types of bioacoustic recorders for this. And one is called the song meter. I'll pass this around. I only have one of them, which is why it's not on the table.
Ny fitaovana ilaina raha azahoana ny données dia ireo fitaovana hitantsika ireo. Ty karazany iray ity zao song meter tsy nisy afa-tsy nitokana iny moa taminazy.
And the reason that I only have one of them is because they're the most expensive.
Misy karazany telo moa sady lafo ihany ny vidin'ny fitaovana no tena lafo.
Yeah, so as you can see, it's almost like 3 million ariari. So they're kind of the most expensive. There are smaller ones like these, but they're also fairly expensive.
Le voalohany iny moa zany tena lafo satria 3,400,000 ariary ary ny faharoa 2 millions ariary dia ny fahatelo le somary kely iny 1 million d'ariary.
But the reason that they're expensive is because they have a very high quality microphone that has a low, it doesn't produce a lot of background noise. So you get a very clear signal.
Zany hoe ny tena mahatsara nyreto izy lafo zay moa ny micro ao anatiny tsara zay mazava ny feo azo aminazy fa tsy misy bruit.
And they also, this one you'll see has an actual screen on it. So you can program the device right on the recorder, whereas the other devices you have to configure using the computer beforehand.
Dia alohan'ny ametrahana azy moa dia misy parametra atao anatin'ny fitaovana io zay alamina melo amin'ny ordinateur.
So then moving on, the other one is the big one, this guy. So you can just pop the top. And this is called the Swift. It's made by a university in the United States that I went to for my bachelor's.
Le lehibe voalohany ity no jerentsika dia avy amin'ny université any Cornell. Atsoina hoe Swift moa zany tena atsoina an'ity ray lehibe ity.
So they come in kind of two different cases. One is the regular, and then this one is the durable case, which you need for the rainforest because there's lots of rain and insects, and technology does not like rain and insects.
Dia ny trano moa misy karazany roa, dia ity iray ity no afaka ampiasaina anaty alamando io noho ny orana sy ny biby izay atahorana mety hanimba anazy.
So these are the battery packs. They're really good for long deployments because they fit D batteries, which are the big batteries that you see on your table.
Dia misy an'le fonosana batery izay afaka asiana ny batery lehibe ireny ao anatiny. Moa izy ity somary maharitra ela kokoa zany satria batery pile lehibe io no atao anatiny.
So they're good for long deployments because they can last if you put like 12, they fit 12. So each one is 6 and there's 2. They can last for like 2 to 3 months without needing battery changes.
Dia afaka asiana le batery lehibe 12 ao anatiny satria ny anankiray atonina pile enina, dia ny faharetany iny maharitra 2 hatramin'ny 3 volana mijanona anaty ala any.
And because of that, you also need a really big SD card or a memory card. So there are memory cards on your tables, and you'll see that they are like 256 gigabytes, which is very big. And they actually make 500 gigabyte SD cards too that you can put in.
Dia ny fitaovana ity moa mila carte SD io. Dia mahatratra misy hatramin'ny 500 giga ny carte SD izay hitantsika eny ambony latabatra eny.
And then the last major kind of recorder are the little ones. So these are called audio moths. They're made by a company in England.
Dia ny karazany fahatelo izay ampiasaina moa ity audiomof ity, farany kely indrindra.
So these hold double A batteries, AA batteries, which are the smaller batteries that are on your tables, and they use a micro SD card.
Le pile ampiasaina amin'ity moa pile kely 3A, dia ny carte ampiasaina ao anatiny indray carte micro SD le somary kely tsy ohatran'ny carte SD tamin'ny voalohany iny.
And because this one is smaller, you actually have to change the settings, which we'll get into the different settings in a bit, when you take the battery and SD card out, whereas the big ones, you don't have to do that.
Le kely ity rehefa tsoahana ny bateriany dia lasa ohatrany hoe miverina amin'ny voalohany, dia mila parametrena indray izy fa ny ohatran'ny lehibe iny tsy mila an'izay fa voatahirina ao anatiny eo ihany ny parametra tamin'ny voalohany nanaovana azy.
Yeah, so that's another benefit of the bigger ones. All of these different recorders have different costs and benefits. So you just kind of have to figure out what's best for your study.
Dia izay moa ny tombontsoa amin'ny lehibe noho ny kely ity satria le lehibe afaka mitahiry an'izay moa ny vidiny koa lafo arak'izay koa.
So the bigger ones are also more expensive, obviously. These are the cheapest. So they run only about like 70 or so US dollars.
Dia izay moa ny mahalafo an'le voalohany iny fa ny madinika reto misy hoe afaka vidiana maromaro dia $70 io, mora tsirairay dia $95.
And like I said, there's different batteries and you can use different kinds. So alkaline or rechargeable ones, you can use either kind in the recorders.
Dia ny pile ampiasaina moa misy karazany anankiroa, na alkaline na lithium izay azo chargena io, dia izay koa na le pile lehibe ireny ary.
And then you also need a USB cable normally to connect your computer to the device, and that's to do the configuration, which we'll talk about next.
Dia mila ny câble USB ity ampifandraian'ny fandraisam-peo sy ny ordinateur izay anaovana ny parametra alohan'ny ametahana azy.
Briefly talked about the SD cards already. So the big ones versus the micro SD cards. And they can go up to, like I said, 500 gigabytes.
Ohatran'ny karta SD reto moa le misy hatramin'ny 500 giga fa ireo no nanasokajiny anazy.
You also need something to attach the recorder to. So you normally want to put it up in a tree, which we'll practice doing later on. So something like a cable to wrap the device around to put it up on a tree.
Mila an'ity tady vy misidiny ity moa zany ametahana anazy amin'ny hazo dia misy câble misy karazany roa reo.
So to set up the recorders, if you look at the small ones, you can see where the SD card goes. There's a little picture of it at the top. So you put an SD card in and the batteries. So you guys can all take the SD card and the batteries and put them in.
Dia afaka hitantsika eo misy fametrahana carte izay micro SD dia ny pile dia afaka apetatsika aminazy io reny.
Yeah, so it shows you like the plus minus and the batteries of which way to put them.
Misy ny plus sy moins io moa ny amin'ny batterie dia afaka tonga dia apetatsika zany.
Now we're going to do the other ones, the big ones. So here the SD card is inside. There's a little slot here.
Misy fitoeran'ny karta SD io le amin'ny lehibe io indray tonga dia mora hita mitsangana eo izy.
And then the batteries go in these cases. Again, the plus and minuses are on the battery pack.
Afaka tsoahana tao le fitoerana pile iny ametahana ny pile.
All right. For the people on Zoom, sorry for the technical difficulties. So that's how you would set up a recorder if you were going to put it out. Then you configure it using apps on computer. So this is where you set things like the date and the time.
Dia alohan'ny ametahana ny fitaovana dia mila reglena ny ora anatin'ny fitaovana io amin'ny alalan'ny application amin'ny ordi moa zany no anaovana azy.
And then there's a couple different settings that you have to think about. So this is what the configuration application looks like. It's free to download onto your computer.
Ny application ireglena ny fangalana feo moa alohan'ny ametahana azy dia misy an'ireto zavatra reto izay tsy maintsy atao alohan'ny ametrahana azy.
One of the big things you have to think about is what sample rate you want to use, which is basically what frequency range you want the recorder to record the sounds of.
Ohatran'ny sample rate io zao io ny jerena hoe fréquence firy no tianao ho alaina dia io no mamaritra anisan'ny fréquence ho enregistrena.
So there's a couple different options, like you can see here. Kilohertz is the unit for frequency, and the sample rate, importantly, has to be at least 2 times as high as the frequency of the call that you're interested in.
Dia ohatran'ny hoe refesina amin'ny kilohertz io ny fréquence izay tokony ampitomboina indroa farafahakeliny ho an'ny antso izay tena ilaina moa zany.
Yeah, so for example, the rough lemurs that I study, they're very loud and they produce very high frequency calls. So their roar shrieks can be up to 20 kilohertz, which means that I have to do the 48 kilohertz because 2 times 20 is 40. So it has to be at least 40 then.
Dia ohatra zao ny feon'ny varijasy izay mitabataba mafy moa izy sady avo ny fréquence mihoatra ny 20 kilohertz. Dia zao nataony tokony mila 70 zany farafahakeliny dia nataony eo amin'ny 48 kilohertz io ny sample rate.
Yeah, and the higher the sample rate, the more data, so the faster the SD card will fill up.
Dia ohatran'ny anaty karta SD io somary ambony ny bean'ny données azo.
So Another thing you have to think about is the gain, which basically is just a measure of how much you want the recorder to amplify the sounds that it's recording.
Dia ny faharoa tokony ho tiana koa ny ao amin'ny gain io fahana manamafy ny feo hoe atao mafy kokoa ve ny feo ho enregistrena sa atao ambany.
So this is good for increasing the detection distance, but it can also, if your animal is close to the microphone, it can distort the close-up sounds. So there's a trade-off.
Le hoe raha atao ambony dia afaka mahazo feo alavitra koa. Nefa ny raha vao diso ambony indray dia ny feon'ny biby akaiky lasa miova fa tsy lasa miova tsy ohatran'ny feon'ny biby avy lavitra zany.
You can also set schedules for when you want the recorder to record. So that's what this sleep record is. So the S is for seconds.
Dia afaka asiana fandaram-potoana moa zany anatin'ny recording io izay afaka io asiana hoe sleep duration io dia amin'ny segonda no anaovana an'izay.
So you can set it, for example, to record for 10 seconds every minute or 1 minute every 10 minutes.
Dia afaka atao hoe mi-enregistre izy 5 seconda isaky ny 10 minutes dia ny ao anelanelan'izay izy tsy mi-enregistre.
And that will affect the battery life to obviously the sample. So again, it's a trade-off between how frequently you want the recorder to record and how long you want the batteries to last.
Dia misy fiantraikany amin'ny pile io koa moa zany raha hoe isaky ny inona no maka feo no mandeha ny fitaovana io. Dia raha matetika mandeha izy dia vetivety dia lany ny batterie. Mora somary melanelana dia maharitra ela kokoa.
You can also set the schedule over the course of a day. So, for example, if you only want it to record certain hours, like just at night or just during the day, you can add the times that you want it to record. And the red is showing that it'll record from 5 to 8, from 10 to 12, etc.
Dia isan'andro koa afaka reglena hoe amin'ny ora ohatr' izao ihany tiako andeha ny fandraisam-peo. Ohatran'ny eto izao le hoe amin'ny 5 ka hatramin'ny 9 io izao no mandeha dia amin'ny 10 ka hatramin'ny 12 io dia amin'ny 2 ka hatramin'ny 5 dia amin'ny 9 ka hatramin'ny 7 dia amin'ireo ihany izy no mandeha maka feo arakarak'ilay tsingerin'ny firaketana le hoe 5 segonda isaky ny 10 minitra na arakaraky ny reglena anazy tamin'ny voalohany.
Or if you want it to run continuously, you can say run the whole time between whatever day. Or if you want it to run all 24 hours in the day, you can do that too.
Dia afaka atao mitohy koa izy eto hoe amin'ny 4 ka hatramin'ny 9 io na hoe mandritra ny andro tontolo dia mandeha foana ny fandraisam-peo.
There's a couple different settings related to the frequency range. So the sample rate is the total number of frequencies. But if you wanted to, for example, not record anything below 5 kilohertz, you just want high frequencies, you can also set that.
Dia afaka reglena koa moa ny fréquence hoe tianao alaina fa tsy le tamin'ny voalohany iny fréquence ny rehetrarehetra. Dia raha ohatra hoe ny feo ambony ohatran'ny eto izao ambony 6 io no tianao raisina dia tonga dia ny ambanin'ny 6 sy ny mihoatra ny 18 io tonga dia tsy enregistrena.
We don't really have time to go into like every single setting, but there are user manuals for all of these devices and the configuration apps that you can look at that explain the other kind of advanced settings more.
Zany hoe tsy ho voazavy daholo ny amin'ny zavatra tiany io fa misy an'le torolalana amin'ny site izay ho asehony hoe rehefa avy eo dia afaka mamaky an'izay raha hoe hikitika zavatra betsaka kokoa.
Yeah, so for example, there's this advanced setting which For most cases, the only thing you'll want to do is turn on energy saver mode. There are particular situations where you would want to look into the other settings. But again, for the sake of time, you can look at the user manuals for more information on those.
Dia ohatra hoe toa afaka tsy kitiana aby ireo zavatra ireo fa ny tena ilaina teto zao ny hoe tokony hotsitsiana ny pile dia io enable energy saver mode io no kosena dia izay.
So that's for the audio off. That's what the configuration for the little one looks like. There's a different configuration app for the big one, but it basically goes through the same settings. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, again, it's all the similar settings. So for example, you can set the date and the time.
Mitovy ihany moa zany ny réglagen'ny lehibe sy kely iny fa ny application anaovana azy fotsiny somary samihafa ohatr'izao ny podiny ny pauziny fa mitovy ihany ny fireglena azy.
So you can also set the name of the device and how this is like the sleep record duration, basically how long you want each file to be. So one file to be 1 minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Ohatr'izay ny amin'ity lehibe ity le hoe le amin'ny reglena azy le hoe 4 minitra ny anaovan'ny fandraisam-peo io na 4 minitra ny alehibean'ny données azo.
And just like the other one, you have to set the gain and the sample rate.
Dia ity le gain mitovy tamin'ny le kely teo ihany dia ny sample rate le natao 48 ohatra tamin'ny varijasy teo.
And just like the other app, you can set schedules for when you want it to record standby or sleep, and then when you want it to record.
Dia eto indray ny azy ny fanovana le hoe amin'izao izy no mandeha dia amin'izao no maty.
And for the recorder that I only have one of, the song meter, that also has a different configuration app that looks like this. But again, it's all basically the same settings.
Dia ny fireglena le song meter izay tokana niavaka teo moa zany ohatr'izay ihany ny zavatra reglena ao anatiny ny sample rate sy ny gain reny fa ny pauzin'ny application fotsiny no miova ohatran'izao.
So that's how you would configure it. And you guys are going to get a chance to configure your own devices as well when we get into the practical side of things. But just to give you some familiarity with what it'll look like.
Dia rehefa vita aby ny paramètre amin'ny recorder ao anatiny iny dia eo amin'izay no hoe ohatr'izao ny fomba ametrahana ny fitaovana.
After you have it configured with the schedule that you want, then you're going to go put it up into the forest. So usually you want to put it up off trails, one, so that you don't get human voices interrupting the animals that you're actually interested in.
Dia rehefa vita moa zany ny fametrahana ny fandaharam-potoana hoe amin'izao ny ora tokony hakany feo dia mijery ny toerana ho asiana azy amin'izay. Zany hoe rehefa mandeha anaty ala dia somary alavitry ny lalana fandehanana anaty ala iny mba tsy ahazo ohatran'ny hoe feon'olombelona na zavatra manakotaba zavatra tsy ilaina.
And also for the sake of security, you don't want people trying to steal the recorders.
Dia hoe mba tsy ho hitan'ny olona koa indraindray makafanan'ny olona hoe ho alainy teo iny na ho esoriny teo.
So this is what pictures of the recorders that we put up for our project, and ideally want to put it on something where like the tree has a fork or a branch or kind of something that the recorder can rest on, just so it doesn't like fall down.
Ny hazo asinana azy indray hazo lehibe na misy sapan'ny vaventy moa zany mba tsy ho latsaka na hoe indrindra ohatran'ny amin'ny cyclone ireny atahorana ho tapaka na latsaka enjeran'ny hazo.
So for example, we had about 20 recorders up during the cyclones. We only lost one of them. The cyclone only broke one.
Ohatran'ny tamin'ny nandritran'ny cyclone iny zao 30 mahery ny fitaovana napetaka dia ny anankiray no tsy hita tanatin'izay.
We did have some where the cable broke. So the device was kind of just like hanging on the ground like this, which was scary, but they were okay.
Ohatrany hoe niatona iny izy dia afatotra eo fa tsy maninona ny ametahana azy amin'ny hazo.
And some where the tree fell, but it was on the side where the recorder was not.
Lohatrany hoe ny atahorana raha enjeran'ny hazo aty izy no mety ho simba fa raha ambonin'ny hazo moa zany dia tsy manahy.
This is all just to say that picking a good spot to put it up is very important.
Le hoe ny fisafidianana ny toerana asiana azy zany dia zava-dehibe mihitsy indray alohan'ny ametrahana azy amin'ny hazo.
So once you are in the forest, the only thing you really have to do is turn it on, because you've already done all of the configuration beforehand with the application on the computer.
Dia rehefa ametaka anazy amin'izay dia velomina ilay izy alohan'ny hanodinana azy amin'ny tranony iny.
So if you look at the little ones, the audio moths, you'll see that there's a little switch down here at the bottom, which I've circled in red there. And you'll see it says a couple words. So it should be in the USB/off position right now, which is off.
Dia hitantsika eo amin'ny le kely ity zao hoe somary fotsifotsy asehony amin'ny sary io ny famonoana sy famelomana anazy. Dia amin'izao izy zao maty eo amin'ny off io.
And when you want to turn it on, you would just flip it to custom. You can do that now, flip it to custom. Normally, you'll be looking for a red light. That means that the recording is started, but yours won't do that right now because we haven't done the configuration yet.
Dia afaka andramantsika iny alefa eo amin'ny custom satria dia vao velomina iny dia misy jiro menamena io mirehatra. Dia ny dikan'izay hoe efa manomboka maka feo izy fa amin'izao mbola tsy vita ny paramètre an'iny dia mety tsy mitovy amin'izay no hitantsika eo.
Yeah, so you can see there's two lights. There's a red and a green one. And the combination of which lights are on can tell you different pieces of information.
Dia misy jiro anankiroa mena sy maitso io. Dia arakaraky ny firehatra ireo no misy dikany avy hoe raha vao maitso fotsiny dia mandeha izy na hoe mena fotsiny dia efa mandeha maka feo izy.
So for example, if you don't have a schedule set, which all of those devices don't, you'll see that when you switched it to custom, both the green and the red light started flashing, which is basically an indication that the recorder is telling you it doesn't know what to do, basically.
Ohatran'io zao hoe mena sy maitso io mifandimby mirehatra dia satria mbola tsy misy an'le fandaharam-potoana ao anatiny ao hoe amin'izao no raha tokony hakany feo dia lasa samy mipika ny mena sy maitso io.
But typically if you would have the configuration, it will flash red when it's recording and it will flash green when it's in the sleep mode.
Dia rehefa tafatsofoka amin'izay ny fandaharam-potoana iny dia ny mena no mirehatra rehefa maka feo ary rehefa maty ohatran'ny en veille izy dia maitso no mirehatra.
All of this is in the user manual, so you can always look back to that to see if you're seeing a weird like color and you don't know what it means. All the different color combinations are in the user manual.
Dia ireo karazana lokon'ny jiro moa hita anatin'ny torolalana fampiasana ny audio monf ity.
So for the big ones, it's a similar process, just different buttons. So if you open the big one, there should be kind of little box that's not the battery. Next to where the SD card is, you'll see a tiny little black button that I've kind of circled here. And that's the on-off button.
Dia ho an'le lehibe indray misy ohatran'ny io ny faritany amin'ny sary io ny akaiky ny fitoerana battery io ny famelomana anazy sy famonoana anazy.
It's a little bit confusing because the colors are reversed. So the green means that it's recording and the red means that it's not.
Dia amin'ity indray mifamadika ny lokon'ny jiro io. Amin'ity izy maitso rehefa mi-enregistre feo fa rehefa mena indray izy no tsy mi-enregistre.
So then the audio moth has to go back in the case in a particular way, because if you see on the inside of the case, there's a gray circle, a little gray circle on the inside. That's where the microphone has to line up with.
Dia rehefa velona amin'izay ny fitaovana iny a, dia ny ametrahana azy ao anatiny ao misy ohatran'ny sary micro iny, dia iny ny fanandrify amin'ny le boribory miloko volondavenona io.
And that's because that little gray circle is a special material that lets sound in, but is waterproof.
Boribory hitantsika io moa zany zavatra spesiala mihitsy hoe afaka andehanan'ny feo fa misakana ny orana tsy hiditra ao anatiny.
So on the actual audio moth, you'll see right next to where the number is, there's a little thing that looks like a microphone.
Dia eo akaikin'ny misy numéro-any io moa misy ny sarin'ny microphone io, dia iny ny fanandrify amin'ny boribory volondavenona io.
And so that's what needs to line up with the gray circle. So you want to make sure that you're putting it in with the microphone lining up with where that gray circle is.
Dia ny micro tonga dia mifanandrify amin'io boribory gris-gris io.
And then the case gets clasped closed. So you put it on top and snap it shut.
Somary ampiakarina kely dia aveo ketohana fotsiny ny mamidy anazy.
The big ones are much easier because it's already in a case.
Dia ny lehibe ity indray efa tonga dia anatin'ny tranony ity moa.
So here, all you have to do is just do the snap. So when you're ready to put it up, like we said, it's important to find a good spot to put it up. And then you use the cables like the ones on your table.
Dia rehefa apetaka amin'izay izy dia le ohatran'ny kabla hitantsika ireny le kabla ampiasaina matorana anazy amin'ny hazo.
So you would normally kind of wrap it around a branch like this. And then sometimes what we would do when we put them up is if the cable was still a little bit loose, we would put like a stick kind of inside it like that, just to make sure it was tight.
Dia rehefa metraka anazy dia ahodina amin'ny vatakazo iny na amin'ny sapana vaventy io ny kabla. Dia misy fotoana izy tsy mienjana tsara dia somary nantsofohana ratsakazo io moa hanenjana anazy fa raha vao mihetsiketsika izy dia mety hanova ny feo.
So once you then put it up, there's a couple other pieces of information that you want to collect.
Dia ny zavatra ho alaina rehefa mametaka anazy amin'izay.
So for example, the GPS point is very important so that you know how to find it again.
Ohatran'ny hoe ny coordonnées GPS iny zao iny tsy maintsy ilaina rehefa hitady anazy indray satria mety miova le toerana nametrahana azy.
Especially the little ones, they can be surprisingly difficult to find even if you know exactly where they are.
Ohatran'ny kely io indrindra somary safotra hita rehefa mijanona ela anaty ala dia tsy hita fa ny coordonnées GPS io no mitarika hoe eto misy anazy dia eo manodidina eo amin'izay no hitadiavana azy.
You also want to put the day and the time of the deployment and the device number.
Dia ny ora sy ny daty nametrahana anazy dia ny numéro-an'ny fitaovana ty efa samy manana numéro ahafantarana azy tsirairay avy reny.
And that's so you know which device was where, so that when you look at the data, you know that device 11 was in Vuiparara or in Talatakeli, and you know where it was.
Dia numéro iny ahafantarana hoe fitaovana iza no ary ohatran'ny hoe ny any Vuiparara dia iza no any Talatakely.
What you also want to do is you want to know how big of an area the recorder is going to detect whatever call you're interested in, like the bird or lemur or whatever.
Dia amin'ny famaritana ny toerana misy ny biby amin'izay, ohatran'ny hoe rayon de détection.
So to do that, we do playbacks of a sound at different distances from the device. So we use a big like speaker, and we have a video, a recording of the sound that you want to see how far it will go.
Dia nahafantarana an'izay nandefa oronam-peo amin'ity speaker bluetooth ity, izay feo nampiasainay izao feo ana biby any ivelany ihany fa tsy feo ana biby eto.
And if you were putting it up, we would go maybe 20 meters and press play, and then we would go 50 meters and press play and keep going like that, so that you can see on the spectrogram how far the recording went. Like if you can't see the call that you're playing back in the spectrogram after 500 meters or something like that, then you know that that's the detection radius.
Dia ohatra hoe eto izao ny recording dia afaka 20 metatra mandefa ny playback zay, dia afaka 50 metatra indray, dia afaka 100 metatra hatramin'ny 200 metatra. Dia ny feo ato amin'izay rehefa jerena amin'ny spectrogramme dia samy hafa aby ny paozin'ny spectrogramme ireo isaky ny 20 metatra sy ny 50 metatra io.
So yeah, you can visually see on the spectrogram. You can also use what's called a dB meter, dB for decibel, which is basically a measure of how loud something is.
Dia na koa afaka mampiasa an'ity dB meter ity, decibel meter, izay afaka andrefesana ny hamafin'ny feo, hoe ny hoe mafy zany feo zany na somary ambany.
So the sound meter, you can also, I would have Riza hold the sound meter next to the recording, and we would also take a measure of how loud using that. It gives a number of how loud the sound is. So when you played the sound back close to it, that would be a very high number, and then it would decrease as you went further from the device.
Loatra ny hoe rehefa mampiasa an'iny zao dia izaho mijanona amin'ny toerana misy ny ohatra misy an'ity fangalana feo ity, dia izy mandeha arakarak'izay hoe 20 metatra dia 50 metatra mandefa ny playback feo ato, dia miova arakarak'izay ny chiffre azo avy amin'ny decibel meter ity.
So that's a way to determine how big of an area your device is covering. And that's really important information to determine how far apart you should deploy the recorders.
Dia amin'izay koa no ahitana hoe hatramin'ny 4 metatra any no farany azon'ny fitaovana iny ny feo.
So for example, in that map that I showed with the purple dots of where we put the devices, the Varisia calls can be heard up to about like 700-800 meters away. So we tried to put the recorders about every 3 or 4 kilometers.
Ohatran'ny hitantsika tamin'ny karta teo zao nisy hatramin'ny 700 metatra ohatra ny varidrasy azony tao. Dia izay no nahatonga ny somary nasiany elanelan'ny 5 hatramin'ny 7 kilometatra eo isaky ny fitaovana fangalana feo iny na amin'ny nanaraka ny corridor iny.
Obviously, the detection radius goes in a circle because the microphone picks up sound from 360 degrees, like we talked about.
Satria ny feo alain'ny ity izay manodidina anazy boribory fa tsy voatery hoe faritra anankiray ihany. Dia izay no somary tediavana ny elanelany iny rehefa nametraka anazy.
So if you have 2 up and your detection radius is, 1 kilometer, then you've got this one has 1 kilometer, and then the one over here has 1 kilometer.
Dia raha ohatra hoe 2 kilometatra no natao elanelany eo dia samy azon'izy anankiroa ny feo ana biby anankiray eto ampovoany, dia izay no nanasiana anazy elanelany mihoatra an'izay, fa raha vao latsaky ny 2 kilometatra dia lasa feo anankiray azon'izy anankiroa ato sy ato aby.
And so that information will help you determine things like how many recorders you think you need to cover the area that you want to survey.
Dia arakaraky ny halehibean'ny faritra esana koa no ahitana hoe firina firina elanelany ametahana ny fitaovana fangalana feo.
So I've done a lot of talking so far, and I promise I'm going to shut up now.
Andao ary apetraka amin'izay dia ohatran'ny dia resaka be hoe fa andao ampiarina.
So now we're going to get into the hands-on part. Yeah, and so for the people that are on Zoom, I'll share my screen. We're going to be doing the configuration on this laptop as well. So I'll share my screen so that you can see people changing the configuration settings. And then I'll turn off the Zoom while we run outside to put up the devices. And then we'll come back. And if you'd like to hear about the analysis methods, then you can come back to this same Zoom link, and we'll talk about that in maybe like 20 or 30 minutes, and that'll be recorded as well. So just for the virtual participants. So you'll need the cord to connect the device to the laptop. So you'll see the top has a little USB port that goes in just like you would plug your phone in.
Misy USB iny dia afaka tonga dia atsofoka le izy. Dia ny régler anazy zao ny application ny ordi anankiroa retiny misy afaka i-régler anazy.
You need to know what the frequency of the sound is in order to be able to do 2 times that. So it requires a little bit of previous knowledge about the target species.
The devices have to be in a constant distance in terms of inputting them.
It really depends. The detection radius ends up being. Like how far apart you put the devices depends on how far your signal of interest will get detected.
Yeah, once I get that
detection radius,
I don't want to keep that.
Kind of dependent on the forest too. So a lot of places like a big rock or there's a river you can't get across. So it doesn't have to be like super exact. We had a lot of areas where we were like, we want to put one there. And then it turned out not to be possible because there was like a big cliff. So we tried to just do a general kind of 3 kilometer thing, but that was really a range of like 2 to 6 kilometers apart. So it really depends on like the terrain of the area, and there's no like standard. It's kind of dependent on the actual habitat and the species. So this is what the time app was, like I showed in the PowerPoint, and you'll see right now it thinks it's 1970 because that's the default. It is not 1970. So this, you just press the set time, and you'll see it sets the time to whatever your computer is. So now it's the right date and time. You can set the time zone that you want it to be in. UTC, the universal time. East African time is like UTC +3. If you want, it can either record it in UTC, or if you go up here and you press local time, then it adds. So now we're gonna go into what you do with the data after you get it.
No ataontsika zao rehefa nahazo données amin'izay dia ahoana ny anaovana ny données.
So the recorders obviously save all of this information to the SD card. The file names will look like this. So they have the date and the time embedded in them.
Dia rehefa le données azo enregistré anatin'ny SD card dia tonga dia efa samy asiany anarana tsirairay avy dia misy ny daty sy ny ora.
And the time is when that recording started.
Ny orana nomboany tonga dia mipetaka amin'ny anarany io.
You want to first transfer the data from your SD card to your computer or an external hard drive, and always make sure to back up your data.
Dia avy dia transferena rehefa alaina ny fitaovana dia transferena anatin'ny ordina ny disque dur io ny données.
And then you'll convert the recordings to spectrograms using different software, which we're about to get into.
Dia rehefa eo amin'ny spectrogramme dia mampiasa ny software amin'izay ny spectrogram.
So there's two kinds of main areas of analysis. There's the analysis for if you're just looking for a single species or a single event, like a gunshot, if you're interested in poaching or something like that. So that's single species kind of detection.
Misy karazany roa ny fanaovana analyse. Raha ohatra hoe espèce anankiray na hoe karazany biby anankiray no anaovana analyse.
So for example, like if you're just looking for Varicea, this is a very far away rough lemur calling. So you can either manually go through the spectrograms, which is obviously very time consuming.
Afaka tonga dia jerena maso hoe jerena hita eo amin'ny spectrogram ny paozin'ny fréquence ohatra ny varijasy teo.
Or you can do an automatic analysis through something like a machine learning model.
Na mampiasa modely izay mandeha ho azy amin'ny machine io.
So the basis of machine learning or AI, artificial intelligence, while it sounds scary, the basis is that you give the computer examples of whatever you want it to find, which is called your training data set.
Afaka tonga dia jerena eo apetraka amin'ny modely ao amin'ny solosaina ny modely ny feon'ny espèce iray tiana ho tadiavina dia avy dia mitady izay mifandray amin'iny rehetra anatin'ny données ao ny machine.
And then the computer learns based on different acoustic features. So like down here, these are just different kind of acoustic parameters that the computer is picking up on when it tries to see how to identify a call.
Loatran'ny ambanindreo zao nafantarana hoe feona inona no anasokajina anazy.
Using that set of acoustic features, the model learns what to look for based on the examples that you give it. And then it goes through the rest of the recordings and it basically tries to match them up. So it goes through the spectrogram and it tries to match up the spectrogram with the example calls that you gave it to learn from. And when there's a good enough match, it says, okay, this is a detection.
Mampifandray amin'ny modely natsofoka tamin'ny machine io moa zany mijery ny fréquence amin'ny spectrogram izy dia isaky ny mahita mifanandrify dia avy dia avahany iny atorony eo.
So there's a couple different types of software to do that we'll get into in a bit.
Misy karazany roa ny fanaovana ny analyse ny données io.
So the other kind of main analysis type that you can do other than the single species is more like multi-species or whole soundscape, which were like those indices that I talked about earlier.
Mora kokoa raha espèce iray no anaovana analyse noho ny mitambatra espèce maromaro.
So this is a list of a couple of the different indices and what they're called. You can automatically extract them using different software programs, which I promise we're going to get into next. And again, just as a refresher, it's basically looking at the ratio of different frequencies and the power of those frequencies over time. In theory, the more species there are, the more acoustic space will be used. So the more frequencies there will be used and there will be different levels of power at different frequencies.
Misy karazany maro ny fréquence izay ampiasainao hita amin'ny spectrogram io dia arakaraky ny biby samy manana ny fréquence moa zany.
Yeah, so just the kind of ratio of power of different frequencies over time.
Dia miovaova arakaraky ny tanjaky ny feo koa ny fréquence.
Okay, so this software, there's a couple different options. Each are kind of good for different things. And again, just like the different recorders, each has costs and benefits associated.
Zay arakaraka ny recordeur nampiasaina moa zany no anaovana ny fa mitovy daholo amin'izay ny fanaovana fanadihadiana amin'ny software.
So the first one we're going to talk about is called Arbimon, and it's run by a company called Rainforest Connection. It's free, which is a very big positive, and it's online. It's a web-based thing. So rather than an application on your computer, you access it through the internet.
Dia anisan'ny manao ny fanadihadiana amin'ny software io zao ny Arbimon. En ligne izy io ary maimay foana.
The other big benefit of this is that you don't need to code anything yourself. It doesn't require programming skills.
Leo tsy mila fahaizana programmation na mila code fa
They have a couple different automated functions. So those machine learning models that I was talking about, the automated analysis, they have basically an interface where you can run those types of models without actually having to write the code yourself.
dia efa misy manana modely izay ampiasainy mamatatra sy mitady ny mitovy amin'ny modely iny moa zany izy.
So I can show you what it looks like. So this is what the website looks like. The other good thing about this, there's unlimited storage. So you can upload files and store all of your audio files through the portal.
Illimité ny stockage-ny amin'ny Arbimon ity dia afaka téléchargenao ny données rehetrarehetra zay tiana anaovana analyse.
So this is what it looks, your like kind of homepage would look like. So you can upload data. I've already uploaded some recordings, and you can assign different species that you want to find. You can upload files from your computer onto here. Yeah, and then the training sets and the templates are for the models. So the template, those are the examples.
Dia ny ao amin'ny template sy efa misy modely moa ao amin'ny template sy dia efa ohatra kay ny ao amin'ny efa misy ohatra ao amin'ny template io.
So you tell it like, this is what I want you to find, basically. And then you can run analysis. So this is like the pattern matching function. So this is where, what I was saying, where the model's trying to match up the examples in the rest of the recordings. It's trying to find matches.
Dia le modely apetraka amin'ny pattern io no mitady amin'izay zay mitovy rehetra amin'ny modely iny no tedaviny amin'ny données rehetrarehetra.
So we can just do a quick little example. You tell it what template to use, what recordings you want it to look through, how many recordings there should be per file. And then the threshold is basically the cutoff for the model to say whether something is a match.
Le ohatra manao testa eto zao dia ny template ny modely ao amin'ny threshold dia ny ao amin'ny threshold zay mitovy mifanandrify amin'ny modely nampidirina.
So the number basically means it's matching the pixels in the spectrogram, like the pixels that are that make up the picture of the spectrogram.
Dia ny sary tonga dia hita amin'ny fanandrify amin'ny spectrogram io.
And you can change that. So a low threshold is going to mean you probably will get a lot of false positives. Yeah, so it's basically just a measure of how certain you want the model to be about the match.
Dia eo amin'ny fampitoviana azy zay no hoe mifandray sa tsy mifandray tamin'ny template ny azo tamin'ny données.
I know it sounds complicated, but a lot of it is code that's going on behind the scenes. So we'll just give it a couple minutes. In your jobs here, it will start showing up. So you would go to test 4, show details, and it's saying that it found one other match in the rest of the recordings. So using this template and going through the other files that you wanted it to go through, it says that there's one other match here. And then you can look at it, you can validate it as accurate or not. So there is actually, this is correct, meaning there's a call of interest present. It's correct, it's a Variesia call. So that's just a super small example of how the model works. But this is the input, the output it gives you. The model will show you what it thinks are matches, and then you can manually verify whether the model was correct or not.
Dia ohatra ny hita ambany ito zao ny hoe ny fanandrify tamin'ny modely natao test tanatin'ny données.
So that's Arbimon. There's a couple of other functions. You can do soundscape analysis as well in this, but just to give you an idea of what it looks like and the different kinds of things that you can do with it. So that was Arbimon. The other one is called Raven. It was developed by the same people who make this big recorder.
Dia Raven indray no namokatra ny ty fitaovana anankiray andraisana feo ity.
So here there's free and paid subscriptions, but people in countries in the global south, which Madagascar is included in, get free permanent licenses. So essentially for all of you, it would be free.
Misy maimaimpona dia misy andoavam-bola koa ny fidirana amin'ny Raven. Dia ny aty amin'ny faritsy ny hémisphère sud maimaimpona daholo ny firenena rehetra raha hiditra ao anatiny.
And so this is a desktop application. So it's an application you download onto your computer, not like the other one, Arbimon, which is online.
Dia ity ampiasaina amin'ny bureau amin'ny ordinateur eo fa tsy en ligne ohatran'ny tamin'ny Arbimon.
And it's good for visualizing spectrograms and extracting acoustic features. So it has an automatic acoustic feature extraction function, basically.
Tsara ho an'ny fijerena spectrogram ary fikirakirana ary fitrandrahana endri-javatra.
So just to show you quickly what that looks like, we'll open up Raven. Okay, so this is Raven. And the good thing about Raven is you can do this choose measurements. And these are those acoustic parameters that it can automatically extract.
Dia hita eo ny tiana ho alaina anatin'ny données.
So there, you can see there's a lot of them. You can pick, how many you want. And if you click OK, then you will be able to see here. It automatically will add those measurements here. And if you draw a box, it automatically will show you what the values of those different parameters are.
Ohatran'ny parametra tiana ho azy tonga dia samy avoakany tamin'ilay nisafidiana tamin'ny voalohany teo.
So that's the acoustic feature measurement thing that Raven is really good for.
Dia izay no mahatsara ny Raven io.
The other kind of major software that I'm going to just show it here before we switch back to the slides is called Kaleidoscope.
Dia ny application anankiray koa Kaleidoscope.
And it is not free, unfortunately.
Dia tsy maimaimpona fa dina.
So the downside of this is that it's expensive. It's like $400 for a license, but this is good for those acoustic indices. So for example, each of these are different indices.
Dia misy karazany indisy maromaro afaka kajiana amin'ny Kaleidoscope ty.
So I'll just show you what it looks like quickly. It's automatic, so you don't need to code yourself.
Dia automatika tsy mila code koa moa zany, tsy mila programmation.
It gives you a spreadsheet. These are the files, and then each of these columns is a different index that it's calculated for you.
Dia amin'ny sisiny iny ny anaran'ny données dia ny indisy tiana ho azo reto amin'ny colonne manaraka reto.
So this is good for calculating those soundscape indices. Okay, so back to software. So the Kaleidoscope, that's what I just showed you. It's also a desktop application. Like I said, it's expensive. But the good thing about this is that the company that makes it has a grant program where you can apply for a free license, basically.
Application amin'ny ordinateur ihany koa ny Kaleidoscope. Dia izany hoe efa misy programa azahoana grant avy amin'ny wildlife acoustic.
So while it's not free, there's a way to make it free through the grant program.
Hoe tsy maimaipoana fa izahany ho azo idirana moa zany.
And like I mentioned, it has the automated acoustic index calculation function. That's a big benefit of it.
Dia misy ny fanakambanana automatika dia afaka mikajy ny feo automatika ihany koa.
So those kinds of softwares are no code software. If you know programming in something like R or Python, you can also do all of these analyses in actual statistics programs.
Dia afaka raha mahay code koa dia afaka anaovana analyse statistique ny R na ny Python.
So these are free desktop applications. There are specialized statistical packages for calculating the acoustic indices and for doing the machine learning models to detect species.
Dia mila ny package io raha anao ohatra ny indisy akoustika na resaka analyse statistique.
And if you are interested in learning these, there's a ton of online educational resources where you can like teach yourself how to code.
Dia raha te hianatra anazy dia afaka mianatra en ligne, hita en ligne ao aby ny mombamomba ny R sy Python io.
And then there's just one more that I'll talk about, which is another free online web-based program that does machine learning models that is also no code, called Edge Impulse. For the sake of time, I won't go into it now, but just to let you know that that's another no code platform that can be used to do machine learning models.
Dia misy anankiray afaka ampiasaina koa ny Edge Impulse. Maimaipoana dia tsy mila code fa en ligne.
So that's just the processing the sound files themselves. You can also then, once you've got the detections, for example, like we have a machine learning model for the rough lemurs, the Varicea.
Loatra ny hoe ny feo afaka atao modèle zao ny feo an'ny rough lemur na ny Varicea.
So we run our recordings through the model. It shows us the rough lemur detections, and then we use those detections with the GPS coordinates of the devices to make a map of their distribution.
Dia afaka amoahana ny faritsy ny anaty karta koa raha amin'ny fitsinjarana avy amin'ny point GPS nakana ny feo reo.
And so you can make things like species distribution models and GIS maps. You can look at changes over time, how frequently a species calls, if there's maybe differences between the seasons.
Dia hita ao ny fréquence ny antson'ny ohatran'ny hoe varisy dia mandritra ny fiovana rehefa mandeha koa ny fotoana.
You can also compare different locations, like we're doing with the Varisia, where you're looking at if there are detections picked up at devices that are in different areas.
Dia rehefa amin'ny toerana samihafa no azahoana ny feo dia afaka hita hoe amin'ny faritra aiza avy no misy anazy.
Before and after comparisons, for example, the cyclone, you can actually kind of track the recovery of the habitat after a cyclone.
Dia afaka ampitahina ny vokatra azo raha ohatra hoe misy loza voajanahary mialohan'ny loza sy aorianan'ny loza.
Normally, there's a drop off in sound right after a major event. Animals are calling a lot less frequently.
Lasa ohatran'ny hoe tsy nisy feo tsy hen'ny feo intsony tao aorianan'ny cyclone zao ny ohatran'ny tsy mitovy amin'ny fréquence teo aloha ny fréquence ny antsony ao aorianan'ny cyclone.
And then you can see how the sound builds back up to what it was before the cyclone.
Ohatran'ny hoe hita eo koa ny fiverenan'ny tsikelikely mitombo miverina tamin'ny talohan'ny cyclone.
And you can integrate it with other data. So for example, I have a colleague who's working in the corridor as well, doing botanical plots.
Dia ohatran'ny fampidirana ny resaka plot botanika indray dia ohatran'ny namany zao no manao andray dia no ampifandraisy amin'ny analyse-ny io koa.
We're going to compare her data from the botanical plots to see whether those soundscape indices are different in different quality habitat.
Dia afaka ampitahina eo ny amin'ny soundscape azony sy ny données azo tamin'ny azon'ny namany anankiray izay.
Just some other resources to make you aware of if you want to continue to learn more about passive acoustic monitoring.
Raha hianatra bebe kokoa momba ny passive acoustic monitoring dia misy loharano hafa koa izay afaka atorina.
So the first is Wild Labs, which is an online global conservation tech community. And this is not just for passive acoustics. They also do a lot with camera trapping and GPS tags.
Ny voalohany amin'izany ny Wild Lab izay mpanao mampiasa ny ohatran'ny caméra trap io.
If you're interested in any sort of technology that's being used in conservation, it's a good group to join.
Vondrom-piarahamonina mampiasa ny teknôlôjia izay miaro ny tontolo iainana izy ireo.
But they do have a specific passive acoustic monitoring group, and there's a discussion board that you can post questions to or ask advice on. They post a lot of jobs or grant opportunities as well.
Dia manana groupe manao an'io fanaraha-maso acoustique passive io zareo dia afaka manome grant na afaka antanina na afaka manome torohevitra ihany koa.
It's free to join. You just register for an account online at wildlabs.net.
Maimaimpoana io ary vondrona maimaimpoana ary afaka hidirana.
Another one that you all are well aware of, but is actually a very good one, is Twitter. There's a lot of discussion on Twitter about passive acoustic monitoring, particularly under these hashtags.
Dia anisan'izany koa ny Twitter izay mampifandray amin'ny olona hafa manao acoustique passive io.
So this is also a really great forum to ask questions and ask for advice.
Dia afaka manontany ao amin'ny groupe-ny Twitter ao raha mila fanontaniana na torohevitra.
And then when I send out the slides, I'll add the links to these, but there are a lot of user manuals for all of the different hardware and software.
Dia misy betsaka ny torolalana afaka ampiasana ny audio mofo reo.
So you can always look to those. We're working on translating those user manuals.
Vo eo mandika anazy amin'ny version teny gasy zareo.
And then the same for the software, like Kaleidoscope and Raven, there's user manuals for all of the different software.
Ohatran'ny fampiasana ny Raven sy Kaleidoscope reo koa samy misy torolalana azo ampiasaina daholo.
And like I said, I'll send out a list of the links to all of these resources when I send the slides out so that you can just copy and paste them yourself.
Dia rehefa andefa ny kopian'ny slidesy dia alefany eo koa ny lien afaka ahitana an'ireo.
So that's all from me. I clearly love to talk about this stuff. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me on email or on Twitter. If you don't have a Twitter, I highly recommend getting one. Science Twitter is really great.
Dia afaka mifandray amintsika rehetra izy, indrindra amin'ny Twitter hoe.
You can, email me or message me on Twitter. I'm happy to talk about all of this stuff along with a PDF of the slides.
Firaketan'ny video tamin'ny androany avoaka amin'ny herinandro dia alefany email miaraka amin'ny slide sy ny lien ahitana indray amin'ny herinandro io.
And I also want to just plug my amazing team who trekked all throughout the corridor with me. In 7 months, we hiked 1,400 kilometers.
Reo aby zay no ekipa niaraka tany dia nandeha tambatra ny diana izay mety teny efa lavalava ihany nanaraka ny corridor iny.
Yeah, we did a lot of work to put up all of those devices in the corridor, and they're really, truly amazing. Could not have done it without them. I know that was a ton of information, but I promise the best way is kind of to just start practicing and get your hands on recorders. I was also very lost in the beginning. So if you feel overwhelmed, it's okay. So did I. And now I'm giving talks to other people about it. And I was in the audience for similar talks not that long ago. So I promise it can be done.